Well, in the minds of Puerto Ricans, if you're PNP, tú eres republicano. But, you know, the republicano in Puerto Rico, the republicano of Dr. Barbosa, okay, of Luis Ferre, is a centrist Republican. It's a Jacob Javits, Nelson Rockefeller Republican. They don't exist anymore. Those Republicans are gone.
Or they're being pushed out.
Well, no, they've been pushed out. They're gone. They don't exist. And if they exist, they get wiped out in office. And these Tea Partiers are doing nothing but a repetition of what's happened before in other circumstances with other people, whether it was Ross Perot or you name it. But it's happened before. There's a 20–25% of the American constituency that, you know, is way out there. And so for a guy like Marco Rubio to be elected, he has to go out and appeal to that constituency. Is that enough to elect him? No. But if you add the Cubans and you add the Hispanic vote and you add a lot of centrist and a lot of independent voters that are now angry at Obama or angry at the Democrats or angry at Congress or angry at taxes or angry at wind insurance in Florida or angry that things haven't been solved, where are they going to go? So here's what happens. The Puerto Rican vote, Democrats, are going to vote for Marco Rubio. You say, well, how's that possible? Mario Cuomo. Now, what's that mean? How did Mario Cuomo become governor of New York? You know how? Republican Italians crossed over and voted for an Italian, because now we go back to identity again. What's more important to when Mario Cuomo gets elected? Being Italian or being a Republican? Well, being Italian. So Italian Republicans crossed over and voted for Mario Cuomo. You go look at the record. If it hadn't been for that, Mario Cuomo would not have won the governorship of New York.
Not like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen winning the congressional seat.
But Ileana Ros-Lehtinen's mother is Jewish. And Ileana Ros-Lehtinen crosses over and gets a lot of the Jewish vote because of her mother. And so the point is, all these things, you have to analyze them in context. Yes, Ferre wins the election in 1979 for mayor of Miami with a Latino vote, 90% Cuban. But when a Cuban runs, that's not good enough to be Latino. Now you're a Puerto Rican and Manolo Rebozo is a Cuban, okay?
Now, you have shown us throughout your conversation that how to adapt, or how you better adapt that position on the surfboard. So your identity as a Puerto Rican, even though you have been able to, thank you, even though you have been able to adapt to the changing times of the different electorates that have elected you,
yes,
you have still been able to
okay.
use your Puerto Rican identity to guide your
yes.
policy positions.
Okay. Well, that's another very, very complicated but insightful question. Here's again. Let me do it by telling you a story. In 1978, I went to the United Nations in the Decolonizing Committee, and I testified with Juan Manuel Garcia Pasalacqua and Franklin Delano Lopez. And I remember that I went to see my friend Gene Kirkpatrick. And my friendship with Kirkpatrick was that Kirkpatrick had been was a counselor to Scoop Jackson, and my good friend Senator Scoop Jackson and I was his campaign manager in Florida in 1976. Had put me in the Democratic Party convention on the platform committee. And that was the first time that in the Democratic Party there was a sentence that recognized that Puerto Rico could become a state. In other words, for alternate choices of the future. That was in 1976. So in 1978, I go to testify in the United Nations. and Ambassador Kirkpatrick said, "Oh, you can't do this. This is you're going to hurt the American position." I said, Gene, this is a matter of principle for me, you know. So here was a Puerto Rican mayor of Miami, 1978, and I'm testifying in the United Nations, and I say that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And I used the following logic. Puerto Rico falls under the territorial clause of the United States Constitution. You can't get away from that. I don't care what you say or how you fix it up. And Muñoz tried, he failed. Everybody's tried. You know, I'm a very good friend of Rafael Hernández Colón. He and I were compañeros in Colegio Ponceño. We sat next to each other when we were children, and he was a good friend. To this day, he won't accept that. See? Now, but you cannot get away from the fact that the U.S. Constitution very specifically states that there is a territorial clause. And that means that all issues of sovereignty are under the plenary powers of Congress. How can you get away from that? Now, and to make matters worse, the Supreme Court of the United States in 1921, in the case of Balzac, very specifically said, okay, you're U.S. citizens now. In 1917, all Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens. But you're still under the plenary clause, and the fact is that you really are, but you're not. You know, you are part of us, but you're not part of us, because you are not an incorporated. Now, I would, and if any of you are interested, there's a wonderful lawyer in Florida who just came up with a brand new thesis where he traces the question of incorporation into the state back to Rome. Because you see, during the Civil War in Rome, before the Republic, the way that Rome incorporated Italian cities that were rebellious was through citizenship. So it used the citizenship clause as a vehicle to Romanize these conquered people. And so Edward White in the Supreme Court in 1912 came up with the thesis of incorporation. And that doesn't exist in the Constitution of the United States. So that was an invention. That was creative legislation in the United States Supreme Court. And what Justice White basically said was, he said, yes, there is a territorial clause, but the issue with the territorial clause is that there are unincorporated territories, which is a new definition, and then Puerto Rico falls into that. So here's my point in all this. In the United Nations, what I was saying was that if you are a territory under the territorial clause of the Constitution, and to make matters worse, if the Supreme Court of the United States defines Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory, which is even worse, what are we other than a colony? I mean, that is a colonial position. Well, I had to go in hiding because my uncle was looking for me, and when he finally got a hold of me, he said, "Mijito, ¿cómo tú vas a decir esa barbaridad? ¿Cómo tú te atreves a decir?" I said, but Tío Luis, Puerto Rico is a colony, you know. Well, you know, that was a heresy. That was a heresy for a Republican and for a statehooder in Puerto Rico in 1978. After me, the next one that came along was Carlos Romero Barceló, and he then started talking about Puerto Rico as a colony. But I was the first in 1978. Here's my point. Okay? The other day, a very good friend of mine criticized Luis Dávila Colón. Luis Dávila Colón is, like you, a politologo in Puerto Rico, highly recognized. But he's on the PNP side of things, and he's for statehood. But a very, 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 you know, Juan Manuel Garcia Pasalagua, Luis Davila Colón, and I were always very close friends, even though we see things differently in Puerto Rico. But here's the point. The friend writes a letter, sends me a copy. This is a couple of weeks ago. And he said, you should not, to Luis Davila Colón, talk about the nation of Puerto Rico, because a statehooder cannot talk about nationhood. He says, you don't see the people of Montana talking about nationhood. See, so my answer was this. That's right, because the people of Montana are not a nation. But the people of Puerto Rico are a nation. Now, how do you define nation? Well, Rogers P. Smith, I think is University of Pennsylvania, in his wonderful book, Peoplehood. He defines the issue. And it's a cultural definition. In other words, a people, because he doesn't like to use the word, he distinguishes between nationhood and peoplehood. He says the real issue is peoplehood, not nationhood. And the definition is culture, ethnicity, class, race, history. So we, Puerto Ricans, have a different language, a different culture, a different history, you know. So we are a nation. Anyway, just like you can't get away from the Constitution of the United States and the clause of that exist in there. I just said it a moment ago. ¿Cómo se llama?
Territorial clause.
Huh? The territorial clause. You can't get, just like you can't get away from the territorial clause, you can't get away from the definition of Puerto Rico as a nation. So the question is this, then how can you be for statehood if you recognize that Puerto Rico is a nation? And here's my simple answer. Catalonia. The Spanish state has now declared officially the people, there's 14 million of them, of Catalonia, who, by the way, are responsible for 35% of the economy of Spain, had declared that Catalonia was a nation. So how can a nation be part of another nation? Well, not easily. Not easily. If you don't believe me, ask the Scots. Ask the Irish. You know, ask the Jews in Israel in the difference between the Ashkenazis and the Sephardics. I mean, how can the people of different language, culture, tradition, history coexist? Not easily. That's why in Belgium the Walloons are about to separate from the Francophones. You know? So it's not easy for these things to happen. Can the United States, can Congress accept the state of Puerto Rico as the 51st state? It all depends how you define it. Now, because the issue, see, is not Congress, the issue is Puerto Rico. The issue is the Puerto Ricans, we the people. We the people. In other words, and Muñoz Rivera was the man who synthesizes the best. He said, el poder está en el país. Okay? Muñoz Rivera. What's that mean? Well, it means that the definition in Puerto Rico's political future has to be in Puerto Rico. And it's as American a principle as, you know, it's as American as apple pie. Why? Because it's the consent of the governed. You cannot impose on another people. It has to be the consent of the governed. As long as the people of Puerto Rico do not want statehood, then Puerto Rico cannot be a state. See? Now, that's going to happen. That's going to happen. We're not far from it. If you look at history, you see how every 4 years it goes up, and then it stalled for a long time, and now it's beginning to go up again. But what happens when 58 or 60% of the people of Puerto Rico say, I want statehood? Then, under the territorial clause and under the Treaty of Paris, the decision goes to Washington. So here's the question in Washington.
What do we do?
Do we accept a state of a people who say, this is not New Mexico, huh? This is not Arizona, this is not California, where the Anglos came in and took over the state and the Mexicans were gone. Okay? And Hawaii, that's a misunderstanding, because in the case of Hawaii, when Cook came to the Sandwich Islands, there were over 1 million Hawaiians. When Hawaii was declared a territory of the United States, there were 35,000 Hawaiians left. So it's not the same in Hawaii, because the Hawaiians were wiped out. They were gone, okay? So there was no Hawaiian community in Hawaii. And all these so-called Hawaiians that declare themselves to be Hawaiians are part Filipino, part Japanese, part Chinese, a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of Diaz and Gonzalez and Sanchez in Hawaii. I've been there and talked to those people. And and by the way, in 3 days of looking, I didn't find one Puerto Rican in Hawaii that spoke Spanish, not one. And I met a lot of them. But that's another point. But here's the issue. Here's the issue. Can the United States accept the 51st state in an island that doesn't identify itself in the American pattern of what it is to be an American? Today, the answer is no. Tomorrow? I don't know. With 50 million, there are 50 million Hispanics. The demographers project, forget the immigration of the undocumented. The natural, right now 40% of the births in the United States are Hispanic. 25% of the kids in public schools are Hispanic. What happens when there's 100 million Hispanics in 2040? What happens to the electoral process of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Florida? What happens when there are a dozen United States senators from those states that are named Garcia and Rubio and Martinez and Menendez and etc.? And the answer is, well, you know, that's another story. So I think there is going to be a time when the people of Puerto Rico are going to be able to say, all right, we're a state, but like Catalonia, you know, we have our culture, we have our language, we have our identity. Now, is that possible? Yes. Is it probable? Well, today, no, but tomorrow, yes.
Are there any questions or comments for the mayor as we conclude? Luis?
Luis Reyes. Mr. Mayor, what do you see to be the lessons of a Puerto Rican who has been a mayor and a leader in Florida in your lifetime for the Puerto Rican people that the 4 million who are not on the island of Puerto Rico, but who are also, from the perspective of identity, see themselves as Puerto Ricans, New Yorkers, Puerto Rican Americans? What are the lessons?
Those are three different things.
I understand that, but what are the lessons of a Puerto Rican in a city and in a state that is majority Cuban, Latino, for Puerto Ricans in Illinois, in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Texas, Hawaii?
Okay. Now you come to the crucial point in this whole discussion about Puerto Rico. And here's what it is. See, if you believe, like my friend Juan Manuel García Pasaracua, que somos un pueblo, that we are all Puerto Ricans, then the answer is different. But if you believe, like I do, that the Puerto Ricans in New York and Florida are really just like the Cuban Americans in their third and fourth generation are not, no son cubanos. They're Americans of Cuban heritage, or Cuban American. They go from Cuban to Cuban exile, to Cuban American, to Americans of Cuban heritage, to Americans whose great-grandfather was a Cuban, okay? So the question again is the question of identity. And here's the way I see it, okay? And I see it in Orlando, because we haven't talked about Central Florida very much, but here's where I saw it very clearly. When I go to the Centro Borinqueño in Orlando, and there's a party, I walk in. On one side are all the Puerto Ricans from New York. On the other side are all the Puerto Ricans from the island. It's just like the Ashkenazis and the Sephardic communities in Israel. Man, it's just. And when they walk in the door, so I sat there. I sat close to the entrance, and I was with a person that was sitting. We played a game. I said, let's identify who the people are that walk in. Okay. And when they walked in, New Yorican. The next one, say Puerto Rican. There was a distinction. There is a difference. And it isn't just because the Puerto Ricans that go back to Levittown don't feel comfortable in Levittown and then leave. So it's much more complicated than that. It's a very complicated, because I started out saying that culture is a three-dimensional thing where that is always changing and is always evolving. It's an evolutionary process, okay? So here's the evolution. The Cubans that didn't grow up in Miami, if I'm in a party, I can pick them out like that. The Cubans, they look the same, but there's something about them that tells me, you listen to them talk for 2 minutes, you know they're not Cubans from Miami. They grew up, you know, in Ohio or Chicago or some other place.
Are they different as voters?
Huh?
As voters?
No, that's an interesting thing, but they're not. But that's a generational thing. You wait 2 or 3 generations, and that's my point. My point is that I do think that as a no word as it is of assimilation happens. Just like shit happens, assimilation happens. You know. And the fact is that you may want to be Boricua, and by the way, Boricua is a New York term. When I grew up in Puerto Rico, I never heard anybody talking about themselves as Boricuas. We were all Ponceños. That's how we identified ourselves, you know. And that was the difference between us and the rest of Puerto Rico. We were Ponceños, but Boricua is something that comes out of New York. So here's my point. You go into the third and fourth generation, especially with intermarriage, and you correct me, but the record is 10% every 10 years of intermarriage. That means in 50 years, half of the Puerto Ricans have married into somewhere else, and their children are part Dominican or Jewish or part, you know, like Gerardo Rivera or whatever, you know. So you get all these mix. Don't tell me that the Puerto Ricans are going to be any different than the Polish and the Italians. You know, the Italians said they would always be Italian. Well, you know, you go talk to Andy Cuomo about that. You know, it happens. It's happened in every society, whether it was the Moors in Spain or whether it was the Greeks, the Ottoman Empire in Greece. You know, culture is a multi-dimensional, evolutionary, complicated thing that just keeps on happening, and you never know how these things end up. But the end result is that the 4 million Puerto Ricans here, which are now more than the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, 4,200,000 or 3 million, there's 3,900,000 in Puerto Rico. And pretty soon it'll be 5 million. But as you get into the third and fourth generation, they're Americans of Puerto Rican descent or Latino descent. And so it's different. So the lesson, you asked me what's the lesson? The lesson is different for Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans who live here. Because I'll tell you this, they asked Muñoz. Luis Muñoz Marin was a former governor of Puerto Rico and the father of modern Puerto Rico, and probably, without any question, in my opinion, the greatest Puerto Rican in our history. And he was a multifaceted, multidimensional guy, very complicated, okay, very, very complicated guy. And he also, in my opinion, set Puerto Rico back 50 to 100 years, but that's another story. But,
By the way.
but that, you invite me for another conference, and I'll tell you, I'll tell you how Muñoz destroyed Puerto Rico. But Muñoz was a great, great man. And they asked Muñoz one time, well, Don Luis, how can you accept American citizenship? Doesn't that conflict with your Puerto Ricanidad, with your Puerto Ricanness? And you know what he answered? He said, well, no, because, you know, my being Puerto Rican is, and he answered it in poetic terms. El cafecito y las montañas, and the beauty of Puerto Rico, and the music, and the poetry of Puerto Rico that was in our soul. And so what he was trying to do, what Muñoz did, which was, and I'll give you a preview to my next discussion here at El Centro on Puerto Rican history. What Muñoz did was he tried to denationalize nationalism. He tried to take away the nationalist element in the definition of a Puerto Rican. Eric Williams, who is probably one of the great men of the Caribbean, Oxford-educated historian, probably one of the greatest thinkers, in my opinion, along with Sangor, of the African diaspora in the world. Eric Williams is one of the top. Mandela, Eric Williams, and Sangor are the three greatest African descent human beings that have lived in the last 3 or 4 centuries. Maybe Alexander Dumas has got to be added to that. But here's what Eric Williams said. Eric Williams said, what Muñoz is trying to do in Puerto Rico is impossible, and it will not work. And the Estado Libre Asociado will be a failure. Eric Williams. Now, the reason he said that comes back to my position. The Puerto Ricans, they live in Puerto Rico. And the Puerto Ricans that live in Puerto Rico will always be Puerto Rican, no matter what the status. It doesn't, whether we go to independence, or we keep on drifting in Estado Libre Asociado, or we go to statehood, a Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico will always be a Puerto Rican. A Puerto Rican in New York is a Puerto Rican, maybe the first, maybe the second, 3rd generation, 4th generation. I'm sorry. So it's a different story. So my answer to you is it all depends what you're talking about, who you're talking about. And if you're talking about the Puerto Ricans of Puerto Rico, the story is very different. And if you want to see it, you go with Patricia, or you come with me to Central Florida, to Orlando, and sit with me at the Centro Borinqueño and watch what happens as people walk into the room.
Any other question or comment?
Follow, I imagine from what you just said that if it comes to the terms of a plebiscite, that you would limit that plebiscite, the voting, to people in Puerto Rico, and not include.
You know, that's a very difficult. That's a very difficult thing. I would have no objections if the decision was made to have people who were born in Puerto Rico vote. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's not fair. You know, there's a fairness issue. Why? Are you going to go back to Puerto Rico and live there? If you are, fine. But if you're not, if you're living in New York and you're telling me that you want to vote in New York for Andy Cuomo, okay? But you also want to vote on Puerto Rico? No. You vote there, you vote here. And you can't vote in two places. So if you want to vote here, that's fine. You vote here. If you want to vote in Puerto Rico, then go back to Puerto Rico. You know, or you. So I think there's a fairness issue. Why should we, and I include myself in that, make a decision for the people of Puerto Rico who are going to live in Puerto Rico when I'm not going to have to live whatever it is that I vote for? So in other words, I think there's a fairness issue. But I think the decision belongs to the people of Puerto Rico. And, you know, I told Fortunio, who I don't agree with, Fortunio's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, okay? And I'm a solid Democrat, and he's a very, very right-wing Republican, okay? So, but I told Fortunio, I said, you know, if I had anything to do with it, I don't have any problem with putting in a plebiscite, which would be the fairest plebiscite of all, statehood, yes or no. They won't do it. They're scared. They're scared of losing. But the fact is, in my opinion, they wouldn't lose. Now, they wouldn't win by much, but I guarantee it's over 55%. Right now, if you put that statehood yes or no, I tell you that 55% of the Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico would vote for statehood today. Okay? So I think that's going to happen sooner or later. Somebody's going to have the courage to start all this foolishness of what you exclude ELA, because see, ELA is not a constitutional vote. ELA doesn't exist in the Constitution of the United States. So if it's a constitutional referendum based on the Constitution, you can only ask constitutional questions. And what's that? Do you want to be a state, yes or no? That's what happened with Alaska. In other words, you say Alaska, Hawaii. Well, what happened in Alaska? In the Alaskan case, the people of Alaska got together in a convention, which you could put in this room, okay, because it was so small, at the University of Alaska, and they wrote a constitution for the state, okay. Then they put it on the ballot, but to show you how clever Gruning was, and the people that thought this whole thing up. The big issue in Washington was drag netting, because they would take these boats and they would drag the bays and they would catch all these fish that they would sell, but they would destroy everything. And so they were drag netting with these chains, and the tugboat would just drag this thing, and they would catch all these fish and they would kill everything. And so that was a big ecological thing in Hawaii. Well, they put that on the ballot in Alaska. And so what happened was that the Alaska Constitution for the state was passed, and in that vote was the Tennessee plan, which was you go to Congress and you say, okay, we're a state. Where do we sit? And that's exactly what happened. That was the last time the Tennessee plan was used to become a state. If Puerto Rico were to do that, there's no denying Puerto Rico statehood. There's no way Congress would deny it. There's no way they could deny it. So it's, again, it's the will of the people of Puerto Rico.
What is that Tennessee plan?
You don't know about the Tennessee plan? Well, the Tennessee plan, well, when Tennessee became a state, here's how they became a state. They petitioned Congress for statehood, the territory, and it was denied. It was denied because of the slavery issue. So this was another southern state, and you know we don't want any problems because we're going to end up in a civil war. We do this. This is in the beginning of the 19th century. See, I forget what was 1812 or 8. It was after Jefferson. Jefferson was already gone, and I don't know who was president. I think Madison was president. Okay, so the issue is, well, how does a territory become a state? Well, from the constitutional viewpoint, that's the decision that Congress has to make. But the reality of it is, como dijo Muñoz, el poder está en el país. The power is with the people. So what happened is they drafted a constitution. They had a referendum. The people of the territory of Tennessee voted for the Constitution, which means they voted for statehood, and they elected a two senators, and I think it was one congressman, because it was a very small little territory. And all three of them went to Washington, and then when they got there, they knocked on the door and said, "Where do we sit?" He said, "Well, who are you?" He says, "Well, we're the United States senators from the state of Tennessee." And they said, "Well, no. So that became a big fight in Congress, and within 90 days, Congress conceded, and Tennessee became a state. That's called the Tennessee Plan. There have been 8 states that have gained statehood that way. The last one was Alaska.
They bum rushed the Congress.
Yeah. The next one is going to be Puerto Rico.
One last question or comment.
Yeah, my question is based on the definition you had of nationhood based on language and culture and history that you had. It seems that what you're saying that
Gracias.
the notion of Puerto Ricanhood is not sustainable after when you're out of Puerto Rico.
Yes, that's true.
And when you're here, for sure, more than 2 or 3.
That's my position.
Okay. That's what
But most of these scientists, social scientists, disagree with that. They think, you know, because their Puerto Ricanness, you know, they say we're Puerto Rican forever, and you know that I don't think that's so.
Except that even there's always the fight between who is Puerto Rican, is a Puerto Rican here, someone born here of Puerto Rican parents, or 2 generations or 3 generations afterwards. They may consider themselves Puerto Rican but are not by island Puerto Ricans. And then within Puerto Ricans born here, who's more Puerto Rican?
Yeah.
That is always within the mix also.
You see, my answer to you is individual. You are what you say you are. In other words, I think identity is something that, and you know, the census is recognizing that. Look at how the census deals with it now. The census, in the old days, they would classify you, you know, you were what you are. Okay? Today, you yourself. Now, for example, in Florida, we have a category called others. Okay? So you're white, black, Latino, which is not a race. Okay, but you know, others. 60% of others are Latinos in Florida. You know why? Because they're mixed race people. They don't want to be black. They're not black, you know, but they don't want to be Latinos. So it's very simple to put others. Now, I've got 12 grandchildren. My wife and I had 6 kids, and we have 12 grandchildren. I've got one grandchild who says, whose mother is Nicaraguan, okay, whose father, my son, is half Puerto Rican, half Venezuelan, which is my wife, okay, and he says, I'm a white American. You know, I'm just as white as anybody else. I'm a white American, okay. Others of my children, I've got 2 that say they're Puerto Rican. I've got one who says he's Venezuelan. He's Latino Venezuelan, okay. So what are you? Well, you are what you say you are. And then the question of loyalties, you know, this whole Israeli question, you know, has lent itself for, well, are you Israeli first or American first? Is your loyalty to your being Jewish mean that you have primary loyalties to Israel? Or do you have a, you know, what is that? I mean, it's a fatuous argument that really has, and legally, it was determined in the Supreme Court case of Afroyim. Afroyim was a AFROYIM, was an American Jew who went to Israel, serves in the Israeli armed forces, comes back to the United States, and they take his passport away. And they was, you were in the Israeli army, you became an officer, and you were served for 4 or 5 years, you're not an American, you're an Israeli. Took it to the Supreme Court, and here's what the Supreme Court said. And granted, it was a 5-4 decision, but it stands today. The only way you can take someone's American citizenship away from them is for treason. So you prove, you, Justice Department and State Department, prove that Mr. Afro-Jim was treasonous to the United States. Well, you can't do that. So they dropped it. Afro-Jim is today the law of the land. Now, let me tell you what that means, which was, by the way, an argument that my friends in Puerto Rico, starting with Juan Manuel Garcia Pasalagua and the others, on the soberanista argument, say, well, we can have two passports. We can have a Puerto Rican passport, or we become an independent state, and an American passport. We can be both. Yeah, you can, except for one problem. You have to change the Constitution to do that. See, other than that, you can do that. But you can be today an Israeli, have an Israeli passport, have an American passport. You can be a Spaniard. My wife can claim her German. Her grandmother was German, and her mother was German, so she can be a German citizen. And my kids can have a German European passport. So, you know, this whole question of nationality, state, culture, identity is very, very complicated. And it's just as complicated for the Israelis as it is for the Puerto Ricans.
Y la historia continúa.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. It has been enlightening.